Step back from that scanner. People like you don't fly first class." Those words cut through the bustling noise of Chicago O'Hare International Airport like a knife through silence. They weren't whispered. They weren't muttered under someone's breath. They were declared with the confidence of someone who believed they had every right to say them. Before we dive into this story of power, dignity, and swift justice, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that respect should never depend on how someone looks, hit that subscribe button right now. Because in exactly 8 minutes, the woman who just spoke those words is about to discover that the man she's dismissing owns 15% of the airline she works for, and the man in the expensive suit watching this entire scene unfold from 20 feet away. He's about to remind everyone in Terminal 2 that discrimination always comes with a price. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, this story is for you. Let's see what happens when bias meets reality at 30,000 feet. The fluorescent lights of Chicago O'Hare Terminal 2 hummed with that particular frequency that seemed designed to amplify exhaustion. Gate B7 was buzzing with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers checking phones, flight attendants wheeling crew bags, and the constant announcements echoing across the polished floors. Marcus Thompson stood at the entrance to the first-class boarding lane, his boarding pass for Seat 2A clearly visible in his left hand. At 28, Marcus had learned that comfort trumped appearance during long flights, especially after the grueling 3-day conference in Tokyo that had just netted his engineering firm a $50 million contract. His charcoal hoodie was expensive, but understated. His dark jeans were well-fitted but casual, and his white sneakers had definitely seen better days. To anyone who bothered to look closer, the subtle details told a different story. The hoodie bore a small logo from Thompson Engineering Solutions. His watch wasn't a Rolex, but the carbon fiber smartwatch cost more than most people's monthly salary. The leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder was Italian-made and worth $3,000. But Victoria Cross wasn't looking for details. Victoria Cross commanded Gate B7 like a fortress. At 34, she had spent 8 years with Skyline Airways, and every single day had been a masterclass in reading passengers. Her platinum blonde hair was styled in a perfect bob that never seemed to move even in the recycled airport air. Her navy blazer was tailored to perfection. Her pearl earrings caught the light just right, and her makeup could have graced the cover of a business magazine. Victoria had built her reputation on knowing exactly who belonged where. First class was her domain, her responsibility, her territory to protect. She prided herself on maintaining standards, on ensuring that the premium cabin remained exclusive for the right kind of people. The kind who looked the part. Marcus approached the royal blue carpet that marked the first-class lane. The regular boarding area was already forming the usual chaotic snake that wound back toward the food court, but the priority lane stood empty except for its guardian. "Excuse me, Marcus," said his voice, carrying the slight rasp of someone who had been speaking at conferences for 3 straight days. He stepped onto the blue carpet, his boarding pass ready. Victoria's fingers never paused from their rhythmic typing on her computer terminal. Her acrylic nails, French manicure perfectly maintained, clicked against the keys like hail on a tin roof. She had mastered the art of strategic ignoring, a skill that usually sent confused passengers shuffling back to economy where they belonged. "Excuse me," Marcus repeated, stepping closer to the podium. Victoria's typing stopped. She drew in a slow breath, the kind that clearly conveyed how much of an inconvenience this interruption was to her important work. When she finally looked up, her green eyes made the journey from Marcus's sneakers to his hoodie to his face with the precision of a customs inspection. The look Marcus saw was familiar. He had seen it at exclusive restaurants when he was dressed down after work. He had seen it at luxury car dealerships when he was shopping without a suit. He had seen it in hotel lobbies when he didn't match someone's idea of who belonged in a 5-star establishment. It was a mixture of suspicion dismissal and preemptive exhaustion. Economy boarding hasn't started yet, sir, Victoria said, her voice carrying that specific tone of artificial sweetness that customer service representatives use when they want to sound helpful while being anything but. The regular boarding area is behind you. We'll be calling Zone 5 in about 15 minutes. She gestured vaguely toward the crowded area behind Marcus without taking her eyes off her screen, the universal signal for move along. Marcus didn't move. His posture remained relaxed, but something in his chest tightened. Not anger. He had learned long ago that anger in situations like this only made things worse. It was more like disappointment, the familiar sting of knowing exactly how this was going to play out. "I'm not in Zone 5, Marcus said calmly, extending his mobile phone with the boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen. "I'm in first class, seat 2A. Victoria's laugh was sharp and quick like the bark of a small dog. She didn't reach for the phone. She didn't even glance at the screen. She simply shook her head with the confidence of someone who had seen this performance before. "Sir," she said, leaning forward over her podium and dropping the customer service voice entirely. "This lane is for verified first-class passengers, Diamond status members, and active military personnel in uniform." Her eyes made another pointed journey up and down his casual attire. "It's not for people trying to cut the line with fake boarding passes." The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, other passengers had begun to notice the interaction. A middle-aged Hispanic woman named Rosa Martinez, traveling to see her daughter graduate from NYU, had already pulled out her phone. Something about the interaction felt wrong, and Rosa had learned to trust her instincts about these things. "I have a valid ticket," Marcus said, his voice steady, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Seat 2, a first class. If you scan the code, you'll see." "I don't need to scan anything to know it's either stolen screenshot from the internet or some kind of error in the system." Victoria interrupted, her voice rising just enough to carry to the passengers now openly staring. "We've had issues with people trying to game their way into premium seating all week. Security." The word cut through the gate area like a siren. Victoria waved toward a pair of airport security officers standing near the gift shop, her movements sharp and theatrical. "Security. I have a passenger attempting to board with fraudulent documentation." Marcus felt the familiar weight of a dozen pairs of eyes turning toward him. In the span of 30 seconds, he had gone from a successful business traveler trying to get home to a suspected criminal in the court of public opinion. The transformation was as swift as it was unfair, and Marcus had experienced it enough times to know exactly what was happening. What Victoria Cross didn't realize as she stood there in her perfectly pressed blazer believing she was protecting her airline from a scammer was that her entire career was about to become a cautionary tale. Because 20 feet away, standing in the entrance to the VIP lounge and watching every single moment of this interaction, stood David Mitchell, CEO of Skyline Airways. And David Mitchell had seen enough. Marcus Thompson had never intended to become a cautionary tale about judging books by their covers, but life had a way of casting people in roles they never auditioned for. At 28, he was the youngest senior partner in the history of Thompson Engineering Solutions, the aerospace consulting firm his father had built from a garage in Detroit 30 years earlier. The company now employed over 200 engineers and held contracts with major airlines across North America. Marcus had earned his position through a combination of brilliant engineering minds, ruthless business acumen, and the kind of work ethic that turned 18-hour days into a lifestyle rather than an exception. His MIT graduate degree in aerospace engineering hung on his office wall next to patents for 3 revolutionary aircraft safety systems that were now industry standard. But Marcus's relationship with Skyline Airways went deeper than most people knew. 3 years earlier, when Skyline was struggling with a series of technical failures that threatened to ground their entire fleet, Thompson Engineering had provided the solution. The fix had saved Skyline millions in potential losses and established Marcus's firm as their primary engineering consultant. As part of the payment structure, Marcus had negotiated for equity rather than pure cash compensation. 15% of Skyline Airways was now held by Thompson Engineering Solutions, making Marcus one of the airline's largest stakeholders. It wasn't public information. The ownership was buried in corporate filings that few people bothered to read, but it gave Marcus significant influence over company policies and decisions. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to be denied boarding on an airline he partially owned. Marcus had grown up understanding that success and respect didn't always correlate, especially when you were a young black man in industries that weren't used to seeing people who looked like him in positions of power. His father had taught him early that twice the work would earn him half the recognition, and that dignity in the face of discrimination was often the only weapon he had. He had experienced versions of this scenario before. The restaurant in Seattle where the maitre d' claimed they had no record of his reservation despite the confirmation email on his phone. The luxury car dealership in Los Angeles where salespeople somehow never seemed available when he browsed their lot. The hotel in New York where his corporate credit card was mysteriously declined, forcing him to pay cash for a week-long stay while the issue was resolved. Each incident had taught him that anger was counterproductive and that quiet persistence often revealed more about his accusers than any argument could. Today's lesson at Gate B7 was shaping up to be another chapter in that ongoing education. Victoria Cross had built her entire career on the principle that details mattered. In 8 years with Skyline Airways, she had never received a customer complaint that stuck. She had never been written up for dress code violations. She had never missed a shift or arrived late. Her performance evaluations consistently rated her as exemplary in customer service and superior in maintaining company standards. Victoria saw herself as more than just a gate agent. She was a guardian of the Skyline Airways brand, a frontline defender of the premium experience that first-class passengers expected when they paid top dollar for their seats. Every day, people tried to game the system, showing up with fake passes, expired upgrades, or elaborate sob stories designed to manipulate their way into seats they hadn't paid for. Her physical appearance was as carefully curated as her professional reputation. The blonde bob was refreshed every 3 weeks at a salon that cost more than most people spent on groceries. Her blazers were purchased from department stores that offered payment plans, but they looked expensive enough to command respect. The pearl earrings were a gift from her mother passed down from her grandmother, and they served as a daily reminder that Victoria came from people who understood class and proper behavior. Victoria's methods weren't officially endorsed by Skyline Airways, but they weren't discouraged either. Her supervisors appreciated her ability to handle difficult passengers without escalating situations to management. Her colleagues respected her no-nonsense approach to maintaining order. The frequent flyers in first class often commented on how smoothly their boarding process went when Victoria was working the gate. What Victoria didn't realize was that her success had less to do with company policy and more to do with the fact that her difficult passengers rarely filed complaints. Most people who were denied boarding or questioned about their right to be in first class simply accepted the interaction and moved on. They assumed that Victoria knew something they didn't, that there was some valid reason for the scrutiny. The few who had tried to complain found their reports buried in administrative processes that seemed designed to exhaust their patience rather than address their concerns. Victoria's supervisors had learned that backing their employees against passenger complaints was easier than investigating whether those complaints had merit. Today, Victoria was about to learn the difference between passengers who couldn't fight back and passengers who simply chose not to. The security officers Victoria had summoned were taking their time reaching Gate B7. Airport security at O'Hare moved with the deliberate pace of people who had seen every possible drama unfold in the space between check-in and takeoff. False alarms were more common than real emergencies, and experienced officers had learned to assess situations before rushing in with weapons drawn. Marcus used the delay to observe the crowd that was beginning to form around the gate. Rosa Martinez, the Hispanic woman who had been watching the interaction, now had her phone held at chest level, clearly recording. She wasn't trying to hide her documentation. The red recording light was visible, and she had positioned herself where both Marcus and Victoria would be clearly visible in her frame. Near the windows overlooking the tarmac, a young white woman named Sarah Mitchell was setting up what appeared to be a live stream. Sarah was 20 years old, a college student flying home to New York for fall break, and she had built a modest following on social media by documenting interesting encounters during her travels. Her Instagram account at Sarah's Sky Sightings had 12,000 followers who tuned in for her commentary on airport drama and flight delays. "Okay, everyone," Sarah whispered into her phone, positioning herself where her camera could capture the confrontation. "We've got a situation developing at Gate B7. This gate agent is refusing to let a black passenger board first class, claiming his ticket is fake. She hasn't even looked at it. I'm going live because this feels important." James Wilson, a 35-year-old white businessman from Chicago, was trying very hard to mind his own business. He had noticed the interaction because he was also flying first class and needed to board in the same lane. James had been traveling for business for over a decade, and he had seen enough airport confrontations to know that getting involved rarely ended well for anyone. But something about this particular situation made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the way Victoria had dismissed Marcus without even pretending to examine his boarding pass. Maybe it was the theatrical way she had called for security. Or maybe it was the growing certainty that if James had approached the gate wearing the same casual clothes, the interaction would have gone very differently. James hadn't planned to document anything, but he found himself opening the voice recorder app on his phone. Not to post online, he wasn't the type for social media drama, but because something told him this was going to escalate in a way that someone might later want evidence of. Victoria, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly frustrated with the security officers' leisurely approach to her emergency. She could see them making their way through the crowd, but they were stopping to examine a suspicious bag near the food court and didn't seem to understand the urgency of her situation. "Sir," she said to Marcus, her voice carrying a new edge, "I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from the first-class lane and return to the general boarding area. If you continue to disrupt our boarding process, I'll have no choice but to have you removed from the gate entirely." Marcus looked at Victoria with the kind of patience that could either be mistaken for weakness or recognized as strength, depending on the observer's experience with real power. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a frequent flyer with Skyline Airways, and I have a valid first-class boarding pass for Seat 2A. I'm not disrupting anything. I'm simply trying to board my flight. You can claim to be whoever you want," Victoria replied, her voice now loud enough to carry across the entire seating area. "People like you always have elaborate stories about who you are and why you deserve special treatment. But I know fraud when I see it, and I'm not going to be taken in by people like me." Marcus interrupted, his voice still calm, but now carrying a note that made several passengers look up from their phones. Victoria caught herself mid-sentence, but the damage was already done. The partial statement hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. She had nearly completed a sentence that would have made her meaning crystal clear, and everyone within earshot understood exactly what she had been about to say. Rosa Martinez's phone captured the moment perfectly. Sarah's live stream audience had grown to over 300 viewers, and the comments were beginning to reflect their understanding of what they were witnessing. James Wilson had stopped pretending not to pay attention, and was now openly watching the interaction with the focus of someone who recognized history unfolding. The security officers were finally approaching Gate B7, but they were about to walk into a situation that was far more complicated than a simple case of passenger fraud, because Victoria Cross had just revealed the actual reason she was refusing to board Marcus Thompson, and everyone was watching. Rosa Martinez had been using TikTok for less than a year, but she understood the platform's power better than most people half her age. As a healthcare administrator in Chicago, she had watched social media transform workplace accountability, political movements, and social justice in ways that traditional media never could. When something felt wrong documenting, it wasn't just smart, it was essential. "This is happening right now at O'Hare Airport Gate B7, Rosa whispered into her phone, keeping her voice low enough not to interfere with the confrontation, but clear enough for her audio to register. A gate agent just refused to let a black passenger board first class. She won't even look at his boarding pass, and she just said, "People like you," before catching herself. This is discrimination happening in real time. Rosa's TikTok account at Rosa Reads typically featured book reviews and community health tips for her modest following of 800 users. But this video was different. Within 30 seconds of posting, the view count was climbing faster than she had ever seen. The comments were immediate and passionate. "Keep recording. What airline is this? This man is so calm. Respect," she said. "What now?" Airport Karen alert Sarah Mitchell's Instagram Live was experiencing a similar explosion. Her usual audience of college friends and travel enthusiasts had been joined by viewers who were sharing her stream across other platforms. The viewer count had reached over 500, and the comments were flowing so quickly that she could barely keep up. "Guys, this is escalating," Sarah narrated quietly, holding her phone steady to capture both Marcus and Victoria in frame. The gate agent called security on this man for having a first-class ticket while being black. "I'm not exaggerating. She hasn't even looked at his boarding pass." Security is walking over now. This is Skyline Airways Gate B7, Chicago O'Hare. Her followers were already taking action beyond just watching. Screenshots of the live stream were being shared on Twitter with hashtags like #AirportDiscrimination and #SkylineShame. Reddit users were posting links to the stream in forums dedicated to travel horror stories and social justice documentation. The video was spreading across platforms faster than Sarah could track. James Wilson had initially started his voice recording as personal documentation, but as he listened to the crowd's growing concern, he realized his evidence might be needed for more than just his own peace of mind. He discreetly opened his Twitter account, an account he rarely used except for following industry news, and began typing "witnessing blatant discrimination at O'Hare Gate B7. At Skyline Air gate agent refusing to board black passenger won't scan his ticket called security. Multiple people recording." This is exactly the kind of behavior that needs to stop. #discrimination. #Skyline. Air. #accountability. Matters. The tweet included a photo he had managed to take showing Victoria's aggressive posture and Marcus's calm demeanor. Within minutes, it had been retweeted 40 times and was gaining momentum. Victoria, focused entirely on the approaching security officers, was completely unaware that her interaction with Marcus was being broadcast live to thousands of people across multiple platforms. She had no idea that hashtags with her name and her employer's name were beginning to trend locally, or that her image was being shared with commentary that would make her unemployable in the customer service industry. The viral nature of the documentation was creating something unprecedented: real-time accountability for workplace discrimination. In previous generations, incidents like this happened in isolation with only the immediate witnesses available to corroborate what had occurred. Now hundreds of people were watching Victoria Cross destroy her own career, and they were creating a permanent record of every moment. Officers Rodriguez and Patterson approached Gate B7 with the measured pace of professionals who had responded to thousands of similar calls. Officer Rodriguez, a 30-year veteran of airport security, had developed an instinct for reading situations before getting involved. Officer Patterson, newer to the job but trained in de-escalation techniques, carried a tablet for taking statements and recording incidents. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, directing his question to Victoria while keeping his eyes on both participants in the confrontation. Victoria's relief at the security presence was visible and immediate. She had been feeling increasingly isolated as the crowd around Gate B7 had grown larger and more hostile to her position. The arrival of authority figures felt like validation that she had been right to call for help. "This man is attempting to board with fraudulent documents," Victoria declared, pointing at Marcus with the confidence of someone who believed official backup had arrived. "He's claiming to have a first-class ticket, but he clearly doesn't belong in that cabin." When I refused to let him board, he became argumentative and disruptive. Officer Rodriguez looked at Marcus, taking in his calm posture and relaxed demeanor. In his experience, truly disruptive passengers were usually agitated, aggressive, or showing signs of impairment. Marcus appeared to be none of those things. "Sir, may I see your identification and boarding pass?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Marcus reached into his pocket and produced both his driver's license and his phone with the boarding pass displayed. "Of course. Marcus Thompson, seat 2. A first class to LaGuardia." Officer Patterson leaned in to examine the documents, then looked at Victoria expectantly. "Have you scanned his boarding pass to verify it in the system?" "I don't need to scan obviously fake documents," Victoria replied, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. "I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know fraud when I see it. People like him always have convincing-looking fake passes." The phrase hung in the air like a confession. Officer Rodriguez's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but both Marcus and several nearby passengers caught the change. In his 3 decades of security work, Rodriguez had learned to recognize bias masquerading as professional judgment. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "our protocol is to verify documentation before determining whether fraud has occurred. May I ask why you haven't scanned his pass?" Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound. She had expected the security officers to simply remove Marcus from her gate, not to question her procedures. The realization that she might need to justify her actions rather than simply have them enforced was clearly unexpected. "I'm protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin," Victoria said, her voice rising defensively. "This passenger doesn't match the profile of our premium customers. I'm exercising my professional judgment to prevent a disruption." Officer Patterson was taking notes on his tablet, and Victoria could see him typing her exact words. The documentation process was not going the way she had anticipated. Instead of removing the problematic passenger, security seemed to be building a case file that included her statements and reasoning. Rosa Martinez's TikTok livestream was now reaching viewers in real time, and the comments were becoming increasingly supportive of Marcus and critical of Victoria. She said, "Doesn't match the profile. Discrimination." "Those officers look uncomfortable with her. This man is handling this with so much class. Meanwhile, she's the one being disruptive." Sarah's Instagram audience had grown to over 800 viewers, and people were beginning to recognize the broader implications of what they were watching. Comments were flowing in from viewers who had experienced similar treatment. "This happened to my brother at LAX. Same energy, different airport. She's about to learn what consequences look like." The growing crowd around Gate B7 had reached the critical mass where individual passengers began feeling empowered to speak up. What had started as curious observation was transforming into collective witness, and the mood was shifting decisively against Victoria. "He hasn't done anything wrong," called out a middle-aged white woman from the economy boarding area. "She won't even look at his ticket." "This is ridiculous," added an elderly black gentleman traveling with his wife. "We've been watching this whole thing. That young man has been nothing but polite." Victoria whirled around to face the crowd, her carefully maintained professional demeanor finally cracking under the pressure of public scrutiny. "Everyone needs to mind their own business. This is between me and this passenger. Actually, it's between you and everyone watching," said a young Hispanic man holding up his phone. "Because we're all recording this and it's already online. The revelation that the incident was being broadcast live hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her eyes widened as she looked around the gate area, suddenly noticing the phones pointed in her direction, the recording lights, the growing number of passengers who were no longer pretending not to watch. "You can't record me without my permission," Victoria shouted, though her voice carried less authority than desperation. "Actually, Rosa Martinez called out from her position near the windows. This is a public space and you're a public employee. This is exactly the kind of thing people need to see." James Wilson, who had been reluctant to get involved, found himself speaking up for the first time. "Ma'am, I'm also flying first class today. I'm wearing jeans and a hoodie too. Why haven't you questioned my right to be here?" The comparison was devastating in its simplicity. James and Marcus were dressed almost identically, both carrying expensive bags, both holding first-class boarding passes. The only visible difference between them was their race, and James's question made that difference impossible to ignore. Victoria's response was to become more defensive rather than reflective. "That's completely different," she insisted, though she couldn't articulate why. "How pressed, James? How exactly is it different?" Officer Rodriguez was watching this exchange with growing concern. What had appeared to be a routine passenger dispute was revealing itself to be something far more serious. The crowd's reaction, the multiple recordings, and Victoria's increasingly problematic statements were creating a situation that was spiraling beyond simple gate management. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said to Victoria, "I'm going to need you to scan this gentleman's boarding pass so we can resolve this situation." "I don't have to scan anything," Victoria declared, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm the gate agent and I make the decisions about who boards my aircraft." The possessive language wasn't lost on anyone present. Victoria was claiming ownership of an aircraft worth over $100 million, speaking as though Skyline Airways existed to serve her judgment rather than their paying customers. Sarah's live stream comments were becoming increasingly pointed. "My aircraft, girl. You work at a gate. Someone call her supervisor. This is career suicide in real time. How has nobody fired her yet?" The viral momentum was building exponentially. Rosa's TikTok had been shared over 200 times in the past 5 minutes. Sarah's Instagram Live was being screen recorded by viewers who were uploading clips to Twitter and Reddit. James's initial tweet had been retweeted over 300 times and was gaining responses from verified accounts in the airline industry. But the most significant observer of this entire confrontation had yet to make his presence known. David Mitchell, CEO of Skyline Airways, had been watching from the VIP lounge entrance for the past 10 minutes, and what he had witnessed was about to transform a viral incident into a corporate reckoning. Victoria Cross was about to discover that discrimination always has consequences, especially when the person you're discriminating against is one of your bosses. David Mitchell had been traveling for business for over 20 years, and he had learned to observe airports the way generals observe battlefields. From his position in the VIP lounge overlooking Gate B7, he had watched the entire confrontation unfold with the focused attention of someone who understood that small incidents could reveal large problems. At 45, David had been CEO of Skyline Airways for 7 years, taking over a struggling regional airline and transforming it into a major competitor in the domestic market. His success had come from understanding that airline operations succeeded or failed based on thousands of small interactions between employees and customers every single day. Each gate agent, flight attendant, and customer service representative was effectively representing the company's values to the public. What David was watching at Gate B7 represented everything he had worked to eliminate from Skyline's culture. David had been scheduled to fly to Denver that morning for a board meeting, but a last-minute conference call had delayed his departure. Instead of being frustrated by the delay, he was now grateful for it. The incident unfolding below was exactly the kind of situation that required immediate executive intervention. He had initially noticed the confrontation because of the crowd it was drawing. From his elevated position, he could see passengers gathering around the gate phones being raised, and the unmistakable body language of a situation that was escalating beyond normal gate operations. When he had moved closer to the lounge windows to get a better view, he had been able to hear enough of the conversation to understand exactly what was happening. Victoria Cross was discriminating against a passenger based on appearance, and she was doing it publicly, defiantly, and in front of multiple recording devices. Worse, she was doing it while invoking Skyline Airways authority and policies as justification. Every word she spoke was being attributed to the company David had spent 7 years building. David's approach to Gate B7 was deliberate and measured. He understood that his presence would immediately change the dynamics of the situation, and he wanted to ensure that change served justice rather than simply protecting corporate interests. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, making his appearance less obviously executive. The last thing he wanted was for his intervention to be dismissed as corporate damage control. As he walked toward the gate, David could hear Victoria's voice rising in frustration. "I don't have to scan anything. I'm the gate agent, and I make the decisions about who boards my aircraft." The words stopped David in his tracks. In 7 years as CEO, he had never heard an employee claim ownership of company assets while simultaneously violating company policies. Victoria wasn't just discriminating against a passenger. She was doing it while claiming to speak with Skyline's authority. Ms. Cross David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time he spoke. "Please, step away from the podium." Victoria turned toward the voice with the annoyed expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of important work. Her expectation was clearly that another passenger was trying to involve themselves in a situation that didn't concern them. "Sir, this is airline business," Victoria said dismissively. "Unless you're flying first class, I need you to step back and let me handle this situation." David continued walking toward the podium with the same measured pace. "Ms. Cross," I said, "step away from the podium." "That's not a request." Something in David's tone caused Officer Rodriguez to look up sharply. After 30 years in security, he had developed an ear for different types of authority, and the voice approaching the gate carried the kind of quiet power that suggested significant credentials. Victoria, however, was too deep into her confrontation with Marcus to recognize the shift in dynamics. "I don't know who you think you are, but I have this situation under control. This passenger is attempting to board with fraudulent documents, and I'm protecting Ms. Cross." David interrupted, now standing directly beside the podium. "You have nothing under control. In fact, you've lost all control." For the first time since the confrontation began, Victoria looked directly at the man who was speaking to her. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The face was familiar in a way that made her stomach drop, but her mind couldn't immediately place where she had seen it before. "Ma'am," David continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone within hearing distance pay attention, "my name is David Mitchell. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Skyline Airways, and you just discriminated against one of our passengers while claiming to speak for my company." The words landed like a physical blow. Victoria's face went completely white, then flushed red, then white again, as the implications of what David had just said registered. Her mouth opened and closed without producing sound, and her hands began trembling against the podium. "Mr. Mitchell." Victoria finally managed her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're supposed to be in Denver this morning." "The executive schedule said plans changed," David replied. "And I'm grateful they did, because otherwise I would have missed watching you destroy everything I've spent 7 years building." The crowd around Gate B7 had grown silent. Rosa Martinez was still recording, but she had moved closer to capture the exchange. Sarah's live stream viewer count had exploded past 1,500, and the comments were moving so quickly that she couldn't read them. James Wilson had stopped taking notes and was simply staring at the interaction with the fascination of someone watching history unfold. Officer Rodriguez had straightened to attention, recognizing that the situation had just shifted from passenger dispute to executive intervention. Officer Patterson was typing furiously on his tablet, documenting every word of the exchange. "Mr. Mitchell, I can explain." Victoria started, her voice gaining a desperate edge. This passenger was attempting to board without proper verification. "I was following protocol to protect the integrity of stop," David said, holding up his hand. "Do not make this worse by lying to me. I've been watching this entire interaction from the lounge. I heard every word you said. I saw you refuse to scan his boarding pass. I watched you call security on a passenger whose only crime was being black while trying to board first class." Marcus, who had remained silent during Victoria's confrontation with the officers, finally spoke. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate your intervention, but I can handle this situation myself." David turned to Marcus with an expression of respect and acknowledgement. "Mr. Thompson, I have no doubt that you can handle this situation. But this isn't just about you anymore. This is about the values my company claims to represent and the behavior my employees exhibit in public." The use of Marcus's name caused Victoria's eyes to widen further. If the CEO knew this passenger's name, if he was addressing him with obvious respect, then everything Victoria had assumed about the situation was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. "Mr. Thompson," David continued, "I owe you a personal apology for the treatment you've received today. More importantly, I owe you an assurance that this kind of discrimination will never happen again on a Skyline aircraft or in a Skyline facility." Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but remained silent, allowing David to continue addressing the situation. David turned back to Victoria, and his expression was no longer professional courtesy. It was the look of a CEO who had just watched an employee damage his company's reputation in front of hundreds of online viewers. "Ms. Cross, in the 8 minutes I've been watching this interaction, you have violated our non-discrimination policy, our customer service standards, and our basic human decency requirements. You've done it publicly, defiantly, and while claiming to speak for Skyline Airways." Victoria's attempts at explanation were becoming increasingly frantic as the full scope of her situation became clear. "Mr. Mitchell, I've been with this company for 8 years. I've never had a complaint that stuck. I was protecting our premium cabin from what?" David interrupted. "From our paying customers, from our stakeholders, from the people who make this airline profitable." The word stakeholders caused Marcus to look up sharply. David caught the expression and nodded slightly, indicating that the conversation about Marcus's actual relationship with Skyline Airways was about to become much more interesting. "Ms. Cross," David continued, "before I explain exactly how catastrophically you've mishandled this situation, I want you to tell me about your company training. Specifically, your training on recognizing VIP passengers and corporate partners." Victoria's face went ashen. We have training modules on identifying frequent flyers and business partners, but they don't always travel in, they usually what?" David pressed. "They usually dress the way you think they should dress. They usually look the way you think they should look." The live streams were capturing every moment of Victoria's dismantling. Sarah's viewer count had reached 2,000, and the comments were a mixture of celebration and disbelief. This CEO is not playing around. She's getting fired in real time. Justice being served live. How did she not recognize him? Rosa's TikTok was being shared across multiple platforms, with users adding their own commentary about corporate accountability and the power of viral documentation. The hashtags #VictoriaCross and #Skyline. Accountability were trending in Chicago and beginning to gain traction nationally. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria tried again, her voice cracking, "I was just following protocol. I've seen fraud before, and when someone doesn't match the profile of what profile?" David's voice had taken on the sharp edge of someone who had heard enough. "What exactly is the profile of a first-class passenger, Ms. Cross?" please enlighten me about the specific appearance requirements that justify refusing to scan a valid boarding pass. Victoria realized she was trapped. Any answer she gave would either acknowledge her discrimination or reveal her incompetence. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she searched for words that could somehow justify her actions without admitting fault. Marcus, who had been watching this exchange with the patience of someone accustomed to letting others reveal their own biases, finally spoke again. "Mr. Mitchell, I think Ms. Cross's profile is fairly clear. She assumed I couldn't afford a first-class ticket because I'm black and dressed casually. She refused to verify my documentation because it challenged her assumptions about what successful people look like." David nodded gravely. "Mr. Thompson, I believe you're absolutely correct, and that brings me to the part of this conversation that Mrs. Cross isn't going to enjoy." Victoria looked between David and Marcus with growing panic. The dynamic between the two men suggested a familiarity that went beyond chance encounter, and Victoria was beginning to understand that her situation was even worse than she had initially realized. "Miss Cross, David continued meet Marcus Thompson, senior partner at Thompson Engineering Solutions, and one of Skyline Airways' largest stakeholders. His company holds 15% of our equity and serves as our primary aerospace engineering consultant. The man you just accused of fraud and attempted to remove from our aircraft is quite literally one of your bosses." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the podium to remain standing. The crowd around Gate B7 went completely silent, except for the sound of phones capturing her reaction. Rosa Martinez's TikTok comments exploded. She tried to kick out her boss. "This is the best karma video of all time. She didn't just lose her job, she lost her mind." Sarah's live stream had reached 2,500 viewers, and her followers were sharing the feed across every social platform available. The story was no longer just about airport discrimination. It was about the spectacular consequences of bias meeting power. Marcus looked at Victoria with an expression that managed to convey both disappointment and pity. "Ms. Cross, I gave you multiple opportunities to simply do your job. I showed you my boarding pass. I remained calm when you accused me of fraud. I stayed patient when you called security. All you had to do was scan a barcode." Victoria's voice, when she finally managed to speak, was barely audible. I didn't know. I thought..." "You thought what Marcus asked quietly, that successful black men don't fly first class, that aerospace engineers don't wear hoodies, that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly own part of an airline." The questions hung in the air like indictments. Victoria had no answers because any honest response would require her to acknowledge the racial bias that had driven every decision she had made in the past 20 minutes. David Mitchell looked around the gate area, taking in the crowd of passengers, the recording phones, and the officers who were documenting every word of this interaction. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who was about to make decisions that would affect multiple lives. "Mr. Thompson, on behalf of Skyline Airways, I offer you our sincere apologies for the discrimination you've experienced today. Ms. Cross's behavior is unacceptable, inexcusable, and absolutely contrary to our company values." Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing, allowing David to continue. "Mrs. Cross," David continued, turning back to Victoria, "your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated effective immediately." The words "you're terminated" hung in the air like the final gavel in a courthouse. Victoria Cross, who had walked into Gate B7 that morning as an 8-year veteran employee with an exemplary record, was suddenly unemployed in front of hundreds of online viewers and dozens of witnesses. "Mr. Mitchell, please." Victoria's voice cracked as she spoke. "I've been with this company for 8 years. I've never had a complaint that stuck. This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to protect the airline from what David interrupted. from our paying customers, from our business partners, from the people who keep this airline profitable. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, recognizing that his role in the situation was about to change significantly. Mr. Mitchell, do you need us to escort Miss Cross from the gate area? David shook his head. Not yet, officer. I want to make sure Ms. Cross understands exactly why she's being terminated. And I want everyone here to understand that this isn't just about one employee's bad day. This is about accountability. Victoria's face cycled through emotions: disbelief, anger, desperation, and finally panic as the reality of her situation began to set in. You can't do this to me in front of all these people. This is humiliating. I have rights. You had responsibilities, David replied. You chose to ignore them. And yes, this is happening in public because your discrimination happened in public. Your humiliation of Mr. Thompson happened in front of witnesses and cameras, so your consequences will happen in front of witnesses and cameras. Sarah's live stream had reached over 3,000 viewers, and the comments were overwhelmingly supportive of the CEO's actions. This is how you handle discrimination. She's learning that actions have consequences. Public racism gets public consequences, CEO said. Not on my watch. Rosa's TikTok video was being shared so rapidly that she couldn't track the repost count. Users across multiple platforms were adding their own commentary, creating a viral documentation of real-time corporate accountability that was unprecedented in its immediacy and scope. Jennifer Hayes, Victoria's supervisor, had been alerted by other gate agents about the commotion at Gate B7. She arrived just in time to hear David announce Victoria's termination, and her face immediately reflected her understanding that this situation was far beyond routine passenger service issues. Mr. Mitchell. Jennifer said, approaching the group carefully. I'm Jennifer Hayes, Miss Cross's immediate supervisor. Is there anything I can do to help resolve this situation? David turned to Jennifer with an expression that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this conversation. Ms. Hayes, how many complaints have you received about Ms. Cross's treatment of minority passengers? The question was clearly not what Jennifer had expected. Her hesitation in answering provided its own information to everyone watching. We occasionally receive complaints from passengers who feel they've been treated unfairly, but most of them are resolved through standard customer service protocols, Jennifer replied carefully. How many of those complaints involved accusations of racial discrimination? David pressed. Jennifer's discomfort was visible as she realized that her supervision of Victoria was now under scrutiny. Some passengers have made those allegations, but we typically find that there are policy-based explanations for the interactions they're questioning. Marcus, who had been listening to this exchange with interest, finally spoke. Ms. Hayes, are you saying that when passengers complained about being racially profiled by Ms. Cross, you investigated those complaints and found them to be without merit? The direct question from Marcus, whom Jennifer now understood to be a significant stakeholder, put her in an impossible position. Any answer would either acknowledge that she had ignored valid complaints or require her to defend Victoria's actions. Mr. Thompson, we always take customer feedback seriously, but we also have to support our employees when they're following company policies, Jennifer replied. Which company policy authorizes gate agents to refuse to scan valid boarding passes based on their assessment of whether passengers look like they belong in first class? David asked. The question hung in the air without answer because no such policy existed. Jennifer's silence spoke louder than any words could have. Victoria, realizing that her supervisor was not going to provide the support she had expected, made one last desperate attempt to justify her actions. Mr. Mitchell, I was protecting the integrity of the first-class cabin. Just this morning, I allowed the Galloways through without question because they're loyal customers who look professional and respect our standards. I treat all our premium passengers with the respect they deserve. The statement was intended to demonstrate Victoria's customer service excellence, but it had the opposite effect. David's expression shifted from professional disappointment to genuine anger as he processed what Victoria had just admitted. "The Galloways," David repeated. "You mean the couple you prioritized over Mr. Thompson? Tell me more about their loyalty and premium status." Victoria, not understanding that she was digging her own grave deeper, continued enthusiastically. "Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Galloway have been flying with us for years. They're exactly the kind of passengers we want in first class. Well-dressed, polite, they understand how premium service works. They never cause problems like this." David reached for his phone and speed-dialed a number that connected him directly to Skyline's customer service database. The call was answered immediately. "This is David Mitchell. I need you to pull the passenger profile for customers named Galloway who flew out of O'Hare this morning on our LaGuardia flight. I need their status level, payment method, and booking history. Yes, I'll hold." The 30 seconds of hold time stretched like an eternity for Victoria, who was beginning to understand that her example of excellent customer service was about to be examined in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Thank you," David said into the phone. "And when did their status expire?" 4 years ago, and they were flying on what type of tickets today, buddy passes?" "Thank you." David ended the call and looked at Victoria with the expression of someone who had just received confirmation of his worst suspicions. "Ms. Cross, the Galloways haven't been premium passengers for 4 years. Their frequent flyer status expired in 2020, and they haven't maintained it. Today, they were flying on employee buddy passes, which means they weren't even eligible for the first-class boarding lane you prioritized them through." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. The crowd around Gate B7, which had been hanging on every word of this exchange, gasped audibly. Rosa's TikTok comments exploded with reactions. She violated policy for white people, but blocked the black man who actually belonged there. This is getting worse by the minute. The racism just keeps getting deeper. Sarah's live stream viewers were sharing the story across Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook with commentary that was making #VictoriaCross and #GallowayGate trend nationally. The story had evolved from simple discrimination to a perfect example of how bias corrupts decision-making at every level. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of amazement at the scope of Victoria's poor judgment. "You violated federal boarding protocols to prioritize non-eligible white passengers while blocking an eligible black passenger who happens to be one of the airline's owners." Victoria had no response. The mathematical certainty of her situation had become undeniable. She had broken rules to help people who reminded her of herself while creating obstacles for someone who could fire her entire department. David turned to Officer Rodriguez. "Officer, Ms. Cross has admitted to violating federal boarding protocols by allowing non-eligible passengers to board ahead of eligible passengers. I believe that constitutes fraud, and I'd like to file a formal complaint." The legal implications of David's statement were immediately clear to everyone present. Victoria wasn't just losing her job. She was potentially facing criminal charges for discriminatory enforcement of federal aviation regulations. "Mr. Mitchell, please," Victoria pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. "I have a mortgage. I have bills. I've worked here for 8 years. This can't be how it ends." David's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Ms. Cross, this isn't how it ends. This is how it begins. This is the beginning of you learning that discrimination has consequences. This is the beginning of you understanding that bias isn't just morally wrong, it's also professionally stupid." Officer Patterson approached with a clipboard and formal documentation. "Ms. Cross, I'm required to inform you that your access to airport secure areas is being revoked pending investigation of the complaints filed against you. You'll need to surrender your security credentials and any company property." Victoria removed her ID badge with trembling hands, the same badge she had worn with pride for 8 years. As she handed it to Officer Patterson, she seemed to understand for the first time that this wasn't a mistake that could be corrected or a misunderstanding that could be explained away. Jennifer Hayes, realizing that her own position was precarious, stepped forward. Ms. Cross, I'll need you to clean out your personal items from your locker and return any company equipment. This termination is effective immediately with no severance pay. The financial implications hit Victoria like another blow. No severance meant no income while she searched for new employment, but the viral nature of her termination meant that finding new employment was going to be nearly impossible. Her name and face were now associated with discrimination across social media platforms that would be searchable by any potential employer. I need to call my union representative, Victoria said, grasping for any possible recourse. You can certainly call them, David replied, but I should point out that your union contract doesn't protect you from termination for cause, and discriminating against passengers while violating federal boarding protocols constitutes clear cause. Rosa Martinez, who had been recording the entire exchange, felt compelled to speak up. Ma'am, I've been documenting this whole thing. You weren't protecting anything. You were discriminating against a man who was trying to board a seat he paid for. Everyone can see exactly what happened. Victoria turned to Rosa with a look of desperation. You don't understand. This isn't who I am. I'm not racist. I was just doing my job. Your job was to scan boarding passes, Marcus said quietly. You refused to scan mine because you didn't think I looked like I belonged in first class. That's not job performance, that's bias. Sarah's live stream comments were providing real-time reaction to Victoria's attempts at self-defense. I'm not racist. The racist's anthem. Girl, we watched you be racist for 20 minutes. Too late for damage control. The internet never forgets. Officer Rodriguez approached Victoria with a formal escort protocol. Ma'am, I need to escort you to the employee area to collect your belongings and then off airport property. You're banned from returning to O'Hare while the investigation is ongoing. The walk from Gate B7 to the employee area would take Victoria through the main terminal, past hundreds of passengers who had heard about the incident through social media or witnessed it firsthand. The viral nature of the story meant that strangers would recognize her face and potentially record her exit. Can't I leave through a private exit? Victoria asked, her voice small and defeated. Ma'am, you created a public incident, Officer Patterson replied. Public incidents have public consequences. As Victoria was escorted away from Gate B7, the crowd of passengers and the ongoing live streams captured her departure. Her confident stride from the morning had been replaced by the shuffle of someone whose world had collapsed in the span of 30 minutes. Sarah addressed her live stream audience directly. Guys, we just watched someone lose their career because they couldn't treat a black man with basic respect. This is 2024 and people are still learning that discrimination has consequences. Victoria Cross thought she had power, but she just discovered what real power looks like. Rosa's TikTok caption read, "When keeping it racist goes wrong. Gate agent denied black man boarding, turns out he owns part of the airline. CEO fired her on the spot. Justice served cold at 30,000 feet. The viral documentation of Victoria's termination was creating a new standard for corporate accountability. For the first time in aviation history, an act of discrimination had been fully documented, immediately addressed, and swiftly punished in real time with full transparency. Victoria Cross had become a cautionary tale about the cost of bias, and her story was being shared across the internet as proof that racism in customer service would no longer be tolerated or hidden behind corporate bureaucracy. As the elevator doors closed on Victoria's career at Skyline Airways, Marcus Thompson was finally cleared to board his flight home, while David Mitchell began implementing changes that would ensure no passenger would ever again face discrimination at a Skyline gate. Within 2 hours of Victoria's termination, #VictoriaCross was trending in the top 5 hashtags on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The story had spread beyond aviation into general interest, social media, with major influencers sharing clips and offering commentary on corporate accountability and racial bias. Rosa Martinez's original TikTok video had reached 12 million views and was being shared across platforms at a rate that crashed her notification system. The comments section had become a forum for people sharing their own experiences with discrimination in customer service, creating an impromptu community of support and validation. "I didn't expect this to blow up like this," Rosa told Sarah as they waited to board their flights. "I just wanted people to see what happened. I wanted there to be evidence." Sarah's Instagram Live had peaked at over 8,000 simultaneous viewers, making it her most watched content ever. The video had been screen recorded and uploaded to YouTube, Twitter, and Reddit, where it was generating discussion threads with thousands of comments, analyzing every moment of the confrontation. The part that's getting the most shares is when she said, "People like you," Sarah observed scrolling through the responses. Everyone understands exactly what she meant, even though she didn't finish the sentence. James Wilson, who rarely engaged with social media, found his single tweet about the incident had been retweeted over 50,000 times and had generated hundreds of responses from airline industry professionals, civil rights advocates, and travelers sharing similar experiences. Major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. CNN, BC News, and the Associated Press had all contacted Skyline Airways for comment. The Washington Post was preparing an article about viral accountability and its impact on corporate culture. The story was evolving from airport incident to national conversation about bias in customer service. Aviation industry publications were treating the incident as a watershed moment for employee training and customer relations. Within hours, competitors were announcing reviews of their own discrimination policies and promising enhanced sensitivity training for frontline employees. The speed and scope of the viral response was unprecedented in aviation history. Previous incidents of passenger mistreatment had taken days or weeks to gain attention through traditional media channels. The real-time documentation and immediate sharing of Victoria's discrimination had created instant accountability that bypassed corporate public relations strategies entirely. Marcus Thompson, who typically avoided social media attention, found his name trending alongside discussions of business success, dignity under pressure, and the importance of remaining calm in confrontational situations. His handling of Victoria's aggression was being praised as a masterclass in maintaining composure while documenting injustice. David Mitchell's immediate response to the discrimination was being celebrated by corporate leadership experts as an example of how executives should address employee misconduct. His willingness to terminate Victoria publicly rather than handling the situation through private discipline was being analyzed as a new model for transparent corporate accountability. Within 6 hours of the incident, David Mitchell had called an emergency meeting with Skyline's senior leadership team to address the widespread attention the company was receiving and to implement immediate changes to prevent similar incidents. "This isn't just about one gate agent," David told his executives during the emergency session. "This is about understanding that every employee interaction represents our company values, and today our values were publicly tested and found wanting." The meeting resulted in several immediate policy changes. First, all gate agents would be required to scan boarding passes before questioning passenger eligibility. The policy removed subjective judgment from the boarding process and created an electronic record of all passenger interactions. Second, Skyline announced a $25 million investment in comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees. The training would be mandatory ongoing and would include specific modules on recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias in customer service situations. Third, the company established a new position, Director of Passenger Experience and Equity. The role would oversee customer complaints involving discrimination and would have direct authority to investigate and address bias incidents. Marcus Thompson was offered the position as an advisory role in addition to his engineering consulting contract. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus told David during a private conversation after the incident, "but I think the position should go to someone who can dedicate full attention to it. I'll be happy to serve in an advisory capacity and help with the initial framework." Skyline's legal department was working overtime to address potential lawsuits and regulatory investigation. The Federal Aviation Administration had opened an inquiry into the discriminatory enforcement of boarding procedures, and civil rights organizations were monitoring the company's response to determine whether additional action was necessary. The company's stock price had initially dropped 3% on news of the incident, but recovered within the trading day as investors responded positively to David's immediate action and the comprehensive reform package. Financial analysts were noting that swift accountability for discrimination was becoming a valuable corporate asset in an era of viral social media oversight. Jennifer Hayes. Victoria's supervisor was placed on administrative leave pending a full review of her management of previous discrimination complaints. The investigation would examine whether complaints against Victoria had been properly addressed or systematically dismissed, and whether other employees under Jennifer's supervision had exhibited similar patterns of bias. Other airlines were watching Skyline's response carefully and implementing their own policy reviews. Within a week of Victoria's termination, 3 major carriers announced enhanced discrimination training and clearer protocols for passenger boarding disputes. The incident was becoming a case study in business schools and corporate training programs. Victoria's termination video was being used to demonstrate the importance of bias awareness and the consequences of discriminatory behavior in customer service roles. Aviation industry conferences were adding sessions on viral accountability and social media crisis management. The speed at which Victoria's actions had been documented, shared, and resulted in corporate action represented a new reality for airline operations. Marcus Thompson's engineering firm received an influx of consulting requests from companies wanting to review their customer service policies and bias training programs. The incident had inadvertently positioned Thompson Engineering Solutions as an authority on corporate equity and accountability. David Mitchell was invited to speak at multiple business leadership conferences about his handling of the discrimination incident. His decision to terminate Victoria publicly rather than privately was being studied as a model for transparent corporate accountability in the social media age. The viral nature of Victoria's termination had created what business analysts were calling real-time corporate responsibility. Companies could no longer rely on traditional damage control strategies when employee misconduct was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. Victoria Cross herself had become unemployable in customer service roles. Background checks for employment in the aviation industry now included social media screening, and Victoria's viral termination made her a liability for any company concerned about public perception. The hashtag #VictoriaCross hashtag had evolved beyond the original incident to become a broader symbol for consequences of workplace discrimination. People were using the hashtag to share their own experiences with bias and to celebrate instances of swift accountability for discriminatory behavior. Rosa Martinez had gained over 100,000 new followers across her social media platforms, and she was using her increased visibility to advocate for documentation of discrimination and support for people experiencing bias in customer service situations. Sarah's Instagram account had become a destination for travelers to share their own experiences with airline discrimination, creating an informal network of accountability that extended beyond any single carrier. The incident had demonstrated the power of viral accountability to create immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior, bypassing traditional complaint processes that often left victims feeling unheard and perpetrators facing minimal consequences. 6 months after Victoria's termination, Skyline Airways reported a significant improvement in customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers and a decrease in discrimination complaints across all demographics. The changes implemented in response to the incident had created measurable improvements in passenger experience and employee behavior. 3 weeks after the incident at O'Hare, Marcus Thompson sat in David Mitchell's office overlooking the Skyline Airways headquarters in Chicago. The meeting wasn't about engineering contracts or business partnerships. It was about ensuring that the changes implemented after Victoria's termination would have lasting impact beyond the viral moment that had sparked them. The truth is, Marcus said, looking out at the aircraft moving across the tarmac below, this wasn't about revenge. It was never about destroying Victoria's career or humiliating her in public. It was about creating a moment where the choice between dignity and discrimination became impossible to ignore. David nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what Marcus was expressing. Your composure during that entire incident gave everyone watching a clear view of what was actually happening. If you had responded with anger or aggression, the story would have been different. Marcus had spent considerable time reflecting on his response to Victoria's discrimination, particularly his decision to remain calm while she escalated the confrontation. His choice to document rather than retaliate had created space for witnesses to see the bias clearly and for the viral documentation to speak for itself. I learned a long time ago that when people reveal their biases, the most powerful response is to let them finish revealing them, Marcus explained. Victoria told everyone watching exactly who she was and what she believed. My job wasn't to argue with her. It was to make sure people could see the choice she was making. The conversation turned to the new advisory role Marcus had accepted with Skyline's passenger experience initiatives. Rather than focusing on punishment for past discrimination, the position emphasized prevention through training, policy clarity, and cultural change. We're implementing a system where passenger interactions are randomly audited for bias patterns, Marcus explained. Not to catch people breaking rules, but to identify where additional training might be helpful. The goal is to prevent future Victoria Cross situations, not just to react to them after they happen. Marcus's approach to the advisory role reflected his understanding that lasting change required more than viral accountability moments. The real work of eliminating discrimination happened in policy development training programs and cultural shifts that made bias both unacceptable and unnecessary. Victoria Cross had spent the 3 weeks since her termination confronting the reality that her actions at Gate B7 had consequences that extended far beyond losing her job. The viral nature of her discrimination meant that her name and face were now permanently associated with workplace bias across internet platforms that would be searchable by potential employers indefinitely. Job applications in customer service roles were being rejected without interviews once hiring managers discovered her identity. The few employers willing to consider her candidacy required extensive discussions about bias awareness and cultural sensitivity that forced Victoria to confront beliefs she had never previously examined. I never thought of myself as racist, Victoria confided to her sister during a difficult conversation about finding new employment. I thought I was just good at my job, good at maintaining standards. I didn't understand that my standards were actually prejudices. The process of applying for unemployment benefits had required Victoria to explain the circumstances of her termination, forcing her to repeatedly acknowledge that she had been fired for discriminatory behavior. Each retelling of the incident required her to confront the gap between her self-perception and her documented actions. Victoria had begun attending counseling sessions focused on understanding and overcoming unconscious bias. The sessions were helping her recognize the assumptions and prejudices that had influenced her interactions with passengers, particularly passengers who didn't match her preconceptions about success and status. I realize now that I created different rules for different people based on how they looked, Victoria admitted during one session. I thought I was protecting standards, but I was actually enforcing stereotypes. The viral documentation of her termination had become a teaching tool in bias training programs, meaning that Victoria's mistake was being used to educate thousands of other employees about the consequences of workplace discrimination. While painful, she had begun to understand that her experience could serve as a warning that might prevent others from making similar choices. The changes implemented at Skyline Airways in response to the O'Hare incident had created measurable improvements in passenger experience and employee behavior. Customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers had increased significantly, and discrimination complaints had decreased across all demographic groups. Other airlines had adopted similar policy changes, creating an industry-wide shift toward more transparent accountability for customer service bias. The Federal Aviation Administration had used the incident as a catalyst for new guidelines on discriminatory enforcement of boarding procedures. Airport security training programs now included modules on recognizing and addressing discrimination complaints, ensuring that officers like Rodriguez and Patterson were equipped to document bias incidents and support affected passengers. The viral accountability model demonstrated by the O'Hare incident had extended beyond aviation into other customer service industries. Hotels, restaurants, and retail establishments were implementing similar transparency measures and bias training programs to prevent viral discrimination incidents. Business schools were using the Victoria Cross case study to teach students about the intersection of corporate responsibility, social media accountability, and bias awareness in customer-facing roles. The incident had become a standard example of how individual employee actions could impact corporate reputation and financial performance. The broader impact extended to discussions about documentation and reporting of discrimination incidents. The success of real-time recording in creating immediate accountability had encouraged people to document bias when they witnessed it creating a cultural shift toward active intervention in discriminatory situations. Marcus Thompson's engineering firm had expanded beyond aerospace consulting to include corporate equity auditing, helping companies identify and address bias patterns in their customer service operations. The business growth represented the transformation of a discrimination incident into an opportunity for widespread positive change. The lasting legacy of the Gate B7 incident wasn't just Victoria's termination or Marcus's vindication. It was the demonstration that discrimination in customer service would no longer be invisible, ignored, or handled through private disciplinary actions that protected corporate reputation over passenger dignity. 6 months later, when Marcus flew through O'Hare again, he was approached by a gate agent who recognized him and thanked him for the changes his experience had created throughout the airport. The interaction represented the transformation from discrimination to respect that had grown from one viral moment into lasting institutional change. Let me tell you what this story really teaches us, because I've been creating content about workplace justice for years, and the Victoria Cross incident represents something I've never seen before. Immediate, transparent accountability for discrimination that changed an entire industry's approach to customer service. First lesson: you literally never know who you're talking to. Victoria assumed that someone dressed casually couldn't possibly belong in first class, and that assumption cost her everything. In our connected world, the person you dismiss today might be filming tomorrow's viral video, or they might be the person who signs your paycheck. Marcus Thompson didn't lead with his credentials or demand special treatment. He simply asked to be treated with the same respect any passenger deserved. I've been in Marcus's position, and I'll bet many of you have too. That moment when someone looks at you and decides you don't belong somewhere before you've even spoken. The difference between Marcus's experience and most discrimination incidents was the presence of witnesses who documented everything and a CEO who took immediate action. Most bias happens in spaces where there's no accountability, no recording, and no consequences. Second lesson: small acts of bias have massive consequences in our viral world. Victoria thought she was having a private interaction with one difficult passenger. She had no idea that her words were being broadcast live to thousands of people across multiple platforms. In 2024, there is no such thing as private discrimination in public spaces. Every customer service interaction is potentially a viral moment, and every act of bias is potentially career-ending. But here's the deeper truth. It wasn't the viral attention that made Victoria's actions wrong. They were wrong when she refused to scan Marcus's boarding pass. They were wrong when she prioritized white passengers over black passengers. They were wrong when she claimed company authority to justify personal prejudice. The viral documentation didn't create the problem. It revealed a problem that already existed. Third lesson. True power responds with dignity, not aggression. Marcus never raised his voice, never demanded special treatment, never threatened Victoria with his position or influence. He simply stood his ground and asked to be treated fairly. When David Mitchell intervened, he didn't humiliate Victoria for entertainment. He addressed her behavior clearly and implemented changes to prevent future incidents. This is what real power looks like: the ability to create positive change rather than just personal revenge. Marcus could have destroyed Victoria quietly through corporate channels, but instead, he allowed the public documentation to speak for itself and focused on creating solutions that would help other passengers avoid similar experiences. I want to share something personal here. I've been creating content about these stories for 3 years now, and I started because I was tired of seeing discrimination incidents get buried in corporate bureaucracy while nothing actually changed for future victims. The Victoria Cross story represents exactly the kind of accountability I hoped social media could create: immediate, transparent, and focused on prevention rather than just punishment. What struck me most about Marcus's response was his focus on dignity over vindication. He could have gloated when Victoria's assumptions were proven wrong. He could have demanded apologies and compensation. Instead, he used his influence to create lasting change that would benefit passengers he would never meet. That's leadership, and it's the kind of character that deserves respect regardless of what someone is wearing. The speed of consequences in this case, from discrimination to termination in less than an hour, represents a new reality for customer service bias. Companies can no longer afford to ignore discrimination or handle it through quiet internal processes. When bias happens in public, accountability must happen in public, and changes must be visible and measurable. Here's what I want you to take away from Marcus Thompson's experience at Gate B7, because these lessons apply whether you're a customer, an employee, or a business owner. If you're ever in Marcus's position, facing discrimination based on your appearance or background, remember that your response sets the tone for everything that follows. Document what's happening if possible, stay calm even when others don't, and understand that your dignity in the face of bias often reveals more about the situation than any argument could. You don't have to tolerate discrimination, but how you resist it determines whether other people can see clearly what's happening. For those of you working in customer service roles, understand that every interaction you have represents your employer's values to the world. Treat every customer with the same respect you would want your family to receive. If someone doesn't look like what you expect, check your assumptions before you check their credentials. The person you dismiss today might be your boss tomorrow, but more importantly, they're a human being who deserves dignity, regardless of their position or appearance. Business owners and managers pay attention to how David Mitchell handled this crisis. He didn't hide behind corporate lawyers or public relations strategies. He addressed the problem immediately, implemented meaningful changes, and made sure his response matched the severity of the incident. Swift accountability for bias isn't just morally right, it's good business in an era where discrimination can go viral in minutes. To everyone watching these stories, remember that you have power too. When you witness discrimination, your documentation and testimony can create accountability that prevents future incidents. Rosa Martinez and Sarah Mitchell didn't start recording because they wanted to become viral stars. They documented bias because they understood that evidence creates consequences. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that appearance doesn't determine worth, that bias has costs, and that dignity in difficult situations creates space for justice to emerge. Tag someone who works in customer service and remind them that respect costs nothing, but prejudice can cost everything. If you believe in treating everyone with dignity regardless of how they look, join our community by hitting that subscribe button. We're building a space where these stories matter, where justice gets celebrated, and where people learn that character is revealed not by what you wear, but by how you treat others when you think no one important is watching. Because here's the truth. Marcus Thompson demonstrated at Gate B7. Everyone is important. Every interaction matters. And in our connected world, someone is always watching. Make sure what they see reflects who you really want to be. Until next time, treat everyone with respect, document injustice when you see it, and remember that true power is using your influence to lift others up, not tear them down. The next story we tell might be yours, so make sure it's one you're proud of.